Today's essential question, which is number 1 out of 4, is what are Mendel's laws of inheritance? What are Mendel's laws of inheritance? Our first left-hand column is going to be Gregor Mendel's pea plant experiments. Gregor Mendel's pea plant experiments. All organisms of the same species have common characteristics. Colored eyes or hair, for example. However, members of the same species exhibit variations in these characteristics. For example, eyes or hair may exist in a variety of colors. These differences in the organism's characteristics are called traits. Blue eye color is one trait for eye color. Some other traits for this characteristic include brown or green eyes. So, to investigate how organisms inherit traits from their parents, Gregor Mendel bred pea plants. He observed particular traits that appeared from one generation to the next. To keep things simple, he chose to track only characteristics that came in just two forms. He studied the traits of white or purple flower color, as an example. Mendel also made sure to use parent plants that were, quote, true breeding for each trait. If, after many generations of self-pollination, a purple flowered plant produces only purple flower offspring, it is considered true breeding for purple flowers. Mendel's scientific method included crossing two contrasting true breeding plants for two different traits for a particular characteristic. A classic example is the cross between a white flowered plant and a purple flowered plant. These plants are the pea generation, or parental generation. He carefully observed the flower color exhibited by a large number of offspring. These offspring are called the F1 generation, which stands for first filial generation. He then crossbred plants of the F1 generation with each other. And those offspring are called the F2 generation, which again stands for second filial. New left-hand column, we're now going to talk about the results of Mendel's experiment. We just laid out how Gregor Mendel set up his experiment. Now we're going to analyze his results. Surprisingly, Mendel found that all of the F1 generation plants had purple flowers, even though one of the parent plants had white flowers. Mendel wondered whether the trait of white flower color somehow disappeared during the breeding process. This turned out not to be true. When Mendel crossed the purple flower F1 generation plants with one another, approximately 25% of the F2 generation had white flowers. In other words, there was a 3-to-1 ratio of purple-colored plants to white-flowered plants. Mendel observed these same results when he studied the traits for other characteristics, such as pea shape or pod color. Mendel concluded that differences in inherited traits result from alternative versions of genes, which in his day he called factors. We now refer to these differing versions of the same genes as alleles. Mendel also realized that organisms inherit two copies of each allele, one from each parent. He noticed that of the two inherited alleles, one would be expressed and the other would have no effect.
Hi, I'm Doug, and I'm a biologist. Gregor Mendel is known as the father of modern genetics. He was the first to study the passing of traits from parent to offspring, and his studies laid the foundation for modern genetics. Before Mendel, inheritance was thought to be blending, so if you cross a red flower with a white flower, all you'd get were pink flowers. Mendel showed that this was not true. Mendel studied pea plants. He took tall plants, crossed them with short plants, but instead of getting intermediate-sized plants, he got nothing but tall plants in the offspring. And when he took those offspring and self-pollinated them, out came both tall and short plants in the offspring. Mendel did the same thing with the color of the peas. He took green peed plants and crossed them with yellow peed plants and got nothing but green peed plants in the offspring. But when he self-fertilized those offspring, in the next generation, both yellow and green peas came out. So what does this show? It shows that traits are inherited as factors, what we now call genes, and that not every gene you have is expressed, but they can be transmitted to the next generation and be expressed later. One way to understand how particulate inheritance is different is to use the Punnett square.
Each different form of a particular gene is called an allele. There's an allele for blue eyes, an allele for brown eyes, an allele for green peas, and an allele for yellow peas.
If we look on one part of the Punnett square, we have the two alleles contributed by the father. If we look on another part, we have the two alleles contributed by the mother. Under blending inheritance, all those offspring should look the same. But that's not what happens. If we use the Punnett square, we realize that there are different types of offspring produced. There are homozygote. A homozygote is where an individual has two alleles that are the same. There are heterozygotes. A heterozygote is an individual where the two alleles are different. With Mendel, when he took green and yellow peas, you'll notice that you get both green and yellow peas in the offspring. Mendel's experiments led him to find two laws. Let's talk about the law of segregation. A parent has two alleles. The law of segregation says that those two alleles are transmitted independently to the offspring. They segregate. One allele is given to one offspring, another allele is given to another. Mendel's second law is independent assortment. Let's go back to Mendel's peas. Some peas are tall, some peas are short, some have yellow seeds, and some have green seeds. Independent assortment means that the genes that are transmitted to the offspring for seed color are transmitted independently of the genes for height, so that we can get all combinations in the offspring. Genotype refers to the genes the organism has. Phenotype refers to the physical appearance. My genotype is to have two blue-eyed genes. My phenotype is to have blue eyes. The key to understanding what is a dominant and a recessive allele refers to what the organism with a particular genotype, that is what genes they have, with an organism's phenotype. How do they look? I have blue eyes. I know I have two copies of a gene for blue eyes. Let's say little b, little b. Somebody else has brown eyes. They might have two copies of a brown-eyed gene. Let's call them big B, big B. So then the question is, what are the color of the eyes of the heterozygote, big B, little b? That depends on which allele is dominant. In humans, brown is dominant. So the big B, little b genotype, the heterozygous genotype, is brown-eyed. That means that the brown allele is dominant to the blue allele. A monohybrid cross is a cross between two heterozygous individuals. Imagine we cross two people with brown hair. Both are heterozygous for the hair color gene. We can use a Punnett square to show that the offspring produce both heterozygotes and homozygotes. They'll produce one homozygote of one type, one homozygote of another, and two heterozygotes. What do these look like? Well, in the case of brown-haired heterozygote, they'll produce brown-haired homozygotes, and they'll produce brown-haired heterozygotes, and they'll produce blonde-haired homozygotes. The phenotypes that result from a monohybrid cross segregate in a 3-to-1 ratio. For a dihybrid cross, things get a little more complicated. Now imagine the same cross as a monohybrid cross, but let's consider two traits. Not just hair color, but eye color as well. That's where we need our Punnett square to get bigger, because we have to look at the transmission and segregation of all those alleles for both those traits. In this case, a heterozygote who has brown hair and brown eyes mates with another heterozygote with brown hair and brown eyes. We can follow the transmission through to the next generation. You'll notice that all of the parents had brown hair and brown eyes, but the offspring are variable. Mendel showed that these segregate out in a 9-to-3 to 3-to-1 ratio. 9 individuals have brown eyes and brown hair. 3 individuals have brown hair and blue eyes. 3 individuals have blonde hair and brown eyes, and 1 individual has blonde hair and blue eyes.
So what have we learned?
Gregor Mendel is known as the father of genetics because he was the first person to successfully study heredity, or the passing of traits from parent to offspring, and his studies laid the foundation for modern genetics. Mendel's law of segregation states that during fertilization, alleles randomly pair to produce 4 possible combinations. Mendel's law of independent assortment states that genes for different traits are inherited independently of each other. Dominant alleles are expressed in the offspring even if only one dominant allele is present. Recessive alleles must occur in pairs in order for the recessive trait to be seen. Homozygous refers to the fact that an organism has 2 of the same allele for a particular trait, 2 dominant alleles or 2 recessive alleles. Heterozygous refers to the fact that an organism has 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. Genotype is the combination of alleles in an organism, so a heterozygous genotype would consist of 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. Phenotype is a physical appearance of the organism. For example, tall pea plants versus short pea plants, or green peas versus yellow peas.
New left-hand column. Mendel draws conclusions about alleles. Mendel draws conclusions about alleles. Based on his experiments, Mendel concluded that if an organism inherited 2 different alleles for a given character, one allele would fully control the appearance of that character, and the other would not have any effect. In the case of the traits purple and white plant flowers, the purple allele was fully expressed, and the white allele was not expressed at all. Only when the members of the F1 generation were crossed did white flowers appear in the F2 generation. These white-flowered plants did not inherit any purple flower alleles, but inherited 2 copies of the white allele. Alleles that always appear when they are present, such as the purple flower allele, are called dominant alleles. Alleles that are not manifested when a dominant allele is present, such as the white flower allele, are called recessive alleles. Recessive alleles only show in the phenotype when there is no dominant allele. Alleles are often represented by a single italicized letter. Dominant alleles are represented by capital letters, and the recessive versions of the alleles are represented by the lowercase version of that same letter. In this case, capital P or big P represents purple flower color, and little p represents white flower color. At this point, you should be able to answer today's essential question: what are Mendel's laws of inheritance? Please press pause on the video and write your response to today's essential question in the summary box at the bottom of your notes.